If you're someone with scoliosis and you are trying to figure out what to prioritize in your exercise routine, in today's video, I'm going to explain to you when to prioritize stretching in your exercise routine and when to prioritize strengthening with some simple tests that you can do on your own. Welcome to the Strength and Spine YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Beth Terranova. I am a scoliosis specialist physical therapist, as well as a person with scoliosis myself. Stretching can be an important part of your exercise routine, but not every muscle necessarily benefits from being stretched. Some muscles may need more emphasis on strengthening. So I'm going to teach you a little bit about the difference between active range of motion and passive range of motion. This way you can help decipher the two and to determine whether you should be stretching more or strengthening more for a particular muscle group. First, I'm going to explain about passive range of motion. So this is the amount of motion that you can move a muscle through that you're not using really your own strength to do that. So this would be the example of using a stretching strap to stretch your hamstring, or pulling your leg with your hands to get more stretch of your glute muscle. This is where you are really trying to stretch the muscle as far as it can go without any use of other muscles to help get you there. The amount of passive range of motion that you have for a particular muscle is usually dictated by two things. It's dictated by the physical length of that muscle. So our muscles are made up of tiny little building blocks, and some of us genetically might have more of those building blocks. Think about our really flexible people with muscles that are long and able to stretch. And some of us might have less of those building blocks where the muscle is a little bit shorter in that individual. The good thing is that using passive stretching can help you to actually increase the length of the muscle by adding those little building blocks over time. So if you are someone who tends to have shorter muscles, or let's say less flexible muscles when you're stretching using a strap or something to help you get that range of motion, as you increase the time that you spend stretching, there is the potential to increase the physical length of that muscle. The other factor that determines the passive length of your muscle is actually your brain and your nervous system. So your body has some built-in protection systems so that you don't injure your muscle when you're doing an activity that puts a lot of stretch in it. So even though you might have a muscle that is sufficiently long to do a particular activity, your brain will potentially protect you and not let you use the full length of that muscle if it feels unsafe. So let's use an example of where you are trying to do a stretch and you start to feel kind of that sensation, that pull of the muscle, right? That is your brain telling you kind of, okay, don't go too crazy pulling this muscle because I want to protect it. When they look at studies where the brain is not involved in the movement, let's say, for example, someone who has a knee replacement and then has to have a manipulation under anesthesia. So basically they develop scar tissue around that previous surgery, and they're brought into the operating room and put under anesthesia to really just bend that knee as much as they can. We find that they're usually able to bend much, much more under anesthesia because they're not getting that nervous system feedback that they are when they're trying to stretch the muscles themselves. So knowing these two mechanisms of how passive range of motion affects your muscles, it allows you to know that if you have a muscle that is not flexible, you can actually help it to improve its flexibility in two ways. One would be to physically stretch that muscle with your traditional stretching routines. And another way would be actually to strengthen that muscle We have research telling us that when you stretch a muscle under a load, you actually can help to increase the flexibility more easily over time. So for the hamstring, this might actually be something like a deadlift, where when you hinge forward with a deadlift, you put more stretch on your hamstring muscles. As those muscles stretch in that position, they are also strengthening, and this can help to improve your range of motion over time. The other type of motion that we have in a muscle is active range of motion, and this is as far as you can move that muscle group using your own muscle ability, meaning that you are using the strength of your opposing muscles to move through this range of motion. So this is the example where you're stretching your hamstring, or you're moving to put a stretch on your hamstring without using a strap or an outside help. You're using the muscles on the front of your thigh to bring up your leg high enough that where you're feeling that muscle stretching. This is really based on the strength of your muscle at these end ranges. So is your muscle able to produce enough power to get you to the end of the range? Meaning, can your active range match what you're doing with your passive range? People may notice their active range of motion doesn't match their passive range of motion in a few examples where they don't have significant strength to be able to move through that full motion of that muscle or joint, etc. An example of this would be a dancer, where dancers sometimes can have very, very great passive range of motion, where they can create a lot of stretch through their muscles, but they may not always have the active control of those muscles. So they can stretch their leg back so far over their head, but when they're trying to lift that leg against gravity, they may not get the same amount of motion. And that's why actually research tells us that strengthening is very helpful and effective for dancers, because they tend to do better in injury prevention when they have the active strength to protect their range of motion. Another instance where someone's active range of motion might not meet their passive range of motion is if they've had a recent surgery. So for example, someone who's had a rotator cuff surgery, they've just had this rotator cuff repaired, and even though the physical therapist can move their arm for them, they can't move the arm themselves yet because they don't have the significant strength to do that. So now that you understand the difference between passive and active range of motion for different movements, you might be saying, well, how does this apply to me with scoliosis? The cool thing is that once you really understand the difference between active and passive range of motion, it can help you really target what you need as an individual to work on in your flexibility or mobility routine. Because if you have sufficient passive range of motion for a movement, if you are someone who is very flexible, you may not need more stretching in your routine for that movement. You might actually need strengthening for your routine. So here's how I go through deciding whether someone should focus on stretching or strengthening in their flexibility routine for a certain muscle group. And I'm going to use the hamstrings as an example here because that's a common one, and that's one that we've talked about a little bit throughout this video. Of course, if you want to know about other muscle groups, how to test them, how to determine differences in active, passive range of motion, we go over this in a ton of detail in our Stretching with Scoliosis course. So you can go through each step and be able to determine whether you have the adequate passive or active range of motion for many different muscle groups in the body. So using the hamstrings as an example, first we have to make sure that we have an adequate passive range of motion of the hamstrings. So a normal range of motion, and this is based on research that's done on a population of people, person should be able to lift their leg if they're lying on their back close to 90 degrees from the floor. Somewhere between 70 and 90 degrees is usually generally a good range for most people. So if you do that test and you find that you're unable to do that, that might tell you that you need to work on the passive range of motion first. So if you're using a strap to pull up your leg and you can't get to that level of motion, that may tell you that you need to focus on working on that passive range of motion. So you would do more stretching, you would do more time stretching than necessarily strengthening, at least for right now. If you have normal passive range of motion, then you want to look at your active range of motion. So if you're able to bring your leg up using a strap for the hamstrings up to that 70 to 90 degree range, and you're fine with that, and then you take away the strap and you just lift up your leg, can you bring your leg to the same height? If you can bring the leg to the same height, that's good. You can move on from there, you've passed the test. But if you cannot, it's going to tell you that you actually need to work on strengthening for the muscles on the front of your leg. So you would work on strengthening your quads, your hip flexors to help make sure that you can use that end range of motion that you have passively. If you have full passive range of motion that is normal, if you have great active range of motion of that muscle group, then that basically gives you the clear to just move right into more general strengthening. If you probably don't need more mobility work there unless you notice a change, unless you have an injury or an issue, you've shown that you have the adequate motion for that muscle. So you don't need to focus as much on that. You can focus on other muscle groups that might be less flexible or just focus on general strengthening to build up over time. Now that I've given an example of how you can assess your passive versus active range of motion, I hope this gives you a bit of a framework to then determine where you can focus your stretching routine. So if you have adequate active and passive range of motion for a particular muscle, you don't have to spend time necessarily stretching that muscle, right? You've already passed those tests and you can really focus your time on the other muscle groups that need more your help with their flexibility or their mobility. So I've just gone over one example here for the sake of time, but if you need more examples or if you want to know how to create a completely customized routine stretching for your scoliosis curve using these simple tests, then check out our Stretching with Scoliosis course. I'll leave a link in the description, but the way that we go through there is we help you to analyze more about your curve, and then we go through testing all different muscle groups in their active and passive range of motion so that you can put together a stretching and strengthening routine that's going to help you improve your mobility without wasting time on things that are not effective for you. So if you want to check that out, I will leave the link in the description. In our next video of this series, I'm going to help you put together your stretching routine using some of these simple tests. How would you put together a stretching and strengthening routine, and give you a little bit more glimpse onto how we do this for our clients and how you can do this yourself with our Stretching with Scoliosis course.